A former Navy SEAL, struggling to rebuild his life after years of loss, thought surviving a historic Montana blizzard would be his greatest challenge. Instead, he found himself carrying his dying German Shepherd through the snow to a tiny shack beside a frozen river. The woman living there had almost nothing left in the world, yet she gave her last blanket to save a dog she had never met. What followed would uncover a hidden injustice, unite more than 1,000 strangers, and reveal a miracle no one saw coming. Before we begin, please support our channel by subscribing and helping us reach 1,000 subscribers. The Montana blizzard came down like heaven had lost its mercy, burying the river road beneath white darkness and turning every mile into a test of the living. This, the blizzard. Ethan Walker kept both hands tight on the steering wheel of his old pickup, his gray-blue eyes narrowed against the snow, blasting through the headlights. He was 35, tall and powerfully built, with broad shoulders, a strong chest, short dark brown military-cut hair, a sparse beard along his sharp jaw, and the stillness of a man, trained not to panic, even when fear had every right to enter the room. He wore a fitted green military-style jacket with camouflage sleeves, camouflage pants, a black fabric belt, and old military boots worn pale at the edges. No weapon hung at his side. He had left that life behind, or at least he had tried to. Beside him, Ranger lifted his head from the passenger seat. The German Shepherd was 6 years old, black and tan, large-chested and disciplined, with upright ears, amber eyes, and a plain black collar around his thick neck. He had the kind of silence that felt intelligent, as if he listened not only to sounds but to the meaning beneath them. Ethan had trusted soldiers, commanders, maps, and machines in his life. None of them had ever been as loyal as that dog. "Easy, boy," Ethan murmured, though he was not sure whether he was calming Ranger or himself. The road should have been empty. The radio had warned everyone to stay home, but just beyond a bend, a pair of headlights burst through the storm sideways. A delivery truck had lost control on the ice, sliding across both lanes like a wounded beast made of steel. Ethan reacted before thought could form. He jerked the wheel right, slammed the brake, and felt the pickup surrender to the frozen road. The world spun. Metal screamed. Glass shattered inward. The truck dropped off the shoulder and slammed into a ditch with a force that punched the breath from Ethan's lungs. For a moment, there was only ringing in his ears and snow drifting through the broken windshield. Then Ranger whimpered. It was not loud. That made it worse. Ethan twisted toward him, pain flashing through his shoulder. Ranger was trapped half against the dashboard, one front leg twisted beneath him. A jagged strip of metal had torn into the dog's shoulder, dark blood spreading through the black and tan fur. Yet even then, Ranger tried to move toward Ethan, tried to stand, tried to do his job. "No," Ethan said, his voice breaking in a way no enemy had ever managed to make it break. Stay still, buddy." He forced open the crushed door, then crawled around through knee-deep snow. His hands went numb almost instantly. He tore at the bent metal, cutting his palms, ignoring the blood. Ranger's eyes stayed fixed on him, trusting him completely, and that trust nearly destroyed him. When Ethan finally pulled him free, Ranger collapsed into his arms. The dog's body was heavy and frighteningly limp. Ethan looked up and saw the pickup beginning to smoke near the engine. Staying there meant freezing, burning, or both. So he lifted Ranger against his chest and started walking. The storm swallowed sound. It swallowed distance. It swallowed prayer before it could rise very far. Ethan stumbled along the frozen riverbank, with Ranger in his arms, every step dragging pain through his ribs. He had carried wounded men before. He had carried the dead. But nothing had ever felt as unbearable as the weight of his dog growing colder against him. Then he saw it. A faint yellow glow trembled beyond a stand of bare cottonwoods near the river. Not a house. Not really. A poor shack leaned against the storm, built from scrap wood, rusted tin, old tarp, and stubbornness. Smoke curled weakly from a pipe in the roof. Ethan reached the door and struck it with the side of his fist. It opened a crack. The woman inside was small and elderly, 73 at least, with a bent back, thin wrists, silver hair tied in a messy knot, and a deeply wrinkled face softened by tired but watchful eyes. Martha Collins wore a patched brown sweater, a faded gray skirt, fingerless gloves, and boots that looked older than some men's promises. Poverty clung to the room behind her. One cot, one iron stove, a few cans on a shelf, one blanket folded at the foot of the bed. She saw Ethan. Then she saw Ranger. Her expression changed. "Bring him in first," she said. "He's colder than you are." Ethan almost answered, but his throat closed. He carried Ranger inside, and Martha moved with sudden purpose. She pulled the only blanket from her cot and spread it near the stove. She heated water, tore a strip from her own sweater sleeve, and pressed it to Ranger's wound with hands that shook from age but not from fear. Ethan knelt beside them, useless in the most terrible way a strong man can be useless. "He saved me," he whispered. Martha did not look up. "Then we returned the favor." The fire rose. The wind battered the shack. Ranger's breathing turned shallow, then weaker, then almost impossible to hear. Ethan pressed 2 fingers to the dog's neck and felt the pulse fade beneath the fur. For 3 seconds, Ranger did not breathe. Martha leaned over him, placed both hands against his chest, and whispered with the authority of a woman who had argued with death before. "No, son, not tonight. Nobody dies in my house tonight." Ethan Walker woke just before sunrise, to the crackling sound of burning wood and the faint scent of broth simmering over a stove. For several seconds he stared at the ceiling, disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings. The events of the previous night slowly returned to him: the blizzard, the crash, the blood on the snow, and the terrifying moment when Ranger had nearly slipped away forever. He sat upright immediately and turned toward the corner of the shack. The German Shepherd was still lying on the blanket near the stove. His large black and tan body rose and fell with steady breaths. The bandage wrapped around his injured shoulder showed traces of dried blood, but the color had returned to his eyes. When Ranger noticed Ethan looking at him, the dog lifted his head and slowly wagged his tail. The relief Ethan felt was almost painful. For most of his adult life, he had trained himself to control emotions. Military service had taught him that fear could kill and grief could distract. Yet there was something about that dog that bypassed every wall he had spent years building. Ranger had followed him through some of the darkest years of his life. The dog had been beside him when he returned from deployment, beside him when friends were buried, beside him when loneliness became easier than human company. Seeing him alive felt like being given something precious back, after believing it was already gone. Across the room, Martha Collins stood over a small iron stove. In the pale morning light, Ethan could finally see her clearly. She was 73 years old, small and thin, with silver hair gathered loosely behind her head. Deep wrinkles framed her face, but there was a quiet strength in her eyes that reminded Ethan of the strongest people he had ever known. She wore a worn brown sweater patched at the elbows, a faded gray skirt, and old winter boots that had clearly survived many harsh Montana winters. Everything about her suggested hardship, yet there was no bitterness in her expression. "He's stronger this morning," Martha said without turning around. Ethan glanced at Ranger and nodded. "Thanks to you." Martha shrugged, as if saving a dying dog in the middle of a blizzard were nothing unusual. "I just helped him do what he already wanted to do." "And what's that?" "Live." For a moment, Ethan simply watched her. He had spent years meeting people who talked about kindness. Martha was the first person he had met in a long time who practiced it without ever mentioning it. The storm continued for another day, forcing Ethan and Ranger to remain at the shack. During that time, Ranger slowly regained strength. By the second afternoon, he could stand on all 4 legs. By evening, he managed to limp across the room without assistance. Every small improvement felt like a victory. As Ranger recovered, Ethan learned more about the woman who had rescued them. Martha had once worked as a volunteer military nurse. Decades earlier, she had spent years helping wounded service members return home from war. She never described herself as a hero and seemed uncomfortable whenever Ethan praised her. She spoke about those years the same way other people spoke about gardening or cooking. To her, helping others had simply been the right thing to do. One evening, while snow drifted against the windows, Ethan asked how she ended up living beside a frozen river. Martha stirred the soup quietly before answering. "My husband came home from war, carrying things nobody could see," she said. "Nightmares, guilt, memories. He tried to fight them for years." Mun. Ethan immediately understood. Many veterans never completely escaped those battles. "He was a good man," Martha continued. "The best I've ever known. But eventually, those memories won." She didn't elaborate further. She didn't need to. After her husband died, medical bills consumed what little savings they had. A series of bad financial decisions followed. Then came dishonest lenders, confusing contracts, and promises that vanished as quickly as they appeared. Little by little, everything she owned disappeared. The story should have made Ethan angry. Instead, it made him sad. Not because Martha had lost her home. Because she spoke about losing it with the calm acceptance of someone who had been disappointed too many times to expect fairness anymore. Over the following days, Ethan began noticing something strange. People kept coming to the shack. At first, it was an elderly veteran named Harold Benson. Harold was a thin man in his late 60s with a weathered face, watery blue eyes, and an uneven gray beard. His coat was several sizes too large, and his hands shook from years of hard living. Martha greeted him like family, gave him a hot meal, and sent him away with canned food. The next day, a young mother arrived, carrying a little girl wrapped in an oversized winter coat. The woman looked exhausted, with pale skin, dark circles beneath her eyes, and chestnut hair tied into a hurried ponytail. She wasn't asking for money. She simply needed warm gloves for her daughter. Martha found a pair from a box beneath her cot and handed them over without hesitation. Later that afternoon, a young veteran stopped by, seeking directions to a shelter nearly 30 miles away. Martha drew him a map on a scrap piece of cardboard and packed him food for the trip. The pattern repeated itself again and again. People arrived throughout the day carrying problems, worries, and needs. Some stayed only a few minutes. Others remained long enough to share coffee beside the stove. Every person seemed to know Martha. More importantly, every person trusted her. Ethan found himself sitting quietly beside Ranger, observing the steady flow of visitors. What confused him most was the obvious contradiction. Martha possessed almost nothing. Yet somehow she spent her days giving things away: food, clothing, time, comfort, advice, hope. By every logical measure, she should have been the one asking for help. Instead, she seemed determined to help everyone else first. One evening, after another visitor departed, Ethan finally asked the question that had been bothering him. "Why do you keep doing this?" Martha looked genuinely puzzled. "Doing what?" "Helping people," she smiled softly. "Because somebody helped me once." The simplicity of the answer lingered in Ethan's mind long after the conversation ended. On the fourth morning after the storm, a white SUV appeared on the frozen river road. Ranger noticed it immediately. The German shepherd rose to his feet and walked toward the window. His ears stood alert. The fur along his neck lifted slightly. Two men stepped out of the vehicle. The first was tall, clean-shaven, and professionally dressed despite the cold. Blonde hair, expensive coat, polished boots. The second man appeared younger and avoided eye contact from the moment he approached the shack. Neither looked comfortable being there. The taller man knocked once before extending an envelope toward Martha. "Mrs. Collins." Martha sighed quietly. "That's me. I'm required to deliver this notice." She opened the envelope and read the document in silence. The room became very still. Ethan watched her expression. Nothing changed. No surprise. No anger. No fear. That troubled him more than any visible reaction would have. "What is it?" he finally asked. The man answered before Martha could. "Final eviction notice." The words seemed absurd. Ethan looked around the shack. The sagging roof, the damaged walls, the rusted stove, the single cot. This place was barely standing. Eviction from what? He asked. The riverside property is scheduled for redevelopment. How long does she have? 7 days. The men returned to the SUV and drove away. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Outside, sunlight reflected off the frozen river for the first time since the blizzard. Inside, Ranger limped over and rested his head gently against Martha's knee. She stroked his ears without looking away from the notice. "I suppose I always knew they'd come eventually," she said quietly. Ethan took the paper from her hands. At the bottom of the page was the name of the company behind the project. The moment he read it, something cold settled deep inside him, because he recognized that name. And suddenly, this no longer felt like an ordinary eviction. Ethan Walker barely slept that night. Long after Martha had gone to bed and the stove had burned down to glowing embers, he remained seated at the small wooden table, staring at the eviction notice. The name at the bottom of the document kept pulling at his memory. He had seen it before, not in Montana and not recently, but somewhere during the years when he still worked alongside federal investigators after leaving military service. Across the room, Ranger slept near the stove. The German Shepherd's shoulder was healing well, though he still limped slightly whenever he walked. Every so often, one of his ears twitched, responding to sounds beyond the shack walls. Grate, crate. Crate, crate. Ethan trusted that instinct. Ranger had saved lives because of it. The next morning dawned clear and painfully cold. Sunlight reflected off the frozen river like shattered glass. Martha prepared breakfast, using the last few eggs she had saved. Ethan noticed she quietly placed the larger portion onto his plate and pretended not to notice when he switched the plates while she wasn't looking. "You don't have to do that," she said. "Neither do you." Martha smiled faintly. The conversation ended there, but Ethan understood something important. Neither of them was accustomed to receiving help. Both had spent most of their lives carrying burdens rather than sharing them. After breakfast, Ethan asked if he could see any paperwork Martha still had from previous years. She looked surprised, but eventually reached beneath her cot and pulled out an old metal box covered in scratches and rust. Inside were yellowed documents, faded photographs, newspaper clippings, and letters that had survived snowstorms, floods, and countless winters. Most people would have seen junk. Ethan saw history. For nearly 3 hours, he sorted through the contents while Ranger rested nearby. Martha occasionally explained where a document came from, or who appeared in an old photograph. Many papers were useless. Others were incomplete. Then Ethan found something that made him stop. It was a photocopy of an old land agreement dated decades earlier. The signature at the bottom belonged to a retired Army colonel named Thomas Bennett. According to the document, the riverside property had originally been donated to support homeless veterans and struggling military families. A small trust had been created to protect the land from commercial development. Ethan read the document twice, then a third time. "Have you ever shown this to anyone?" he asked. Martha adjusted her glasses and looked at the page. A lawyer looked at it years ago. "What happened?" "He told me proving anything would cost more money than I had." Ethan's jaw tightened. The land should never have been sold. Yet somehow it had changed hands multiple times before ending up with the development company now trying to remove Martha. That afternoon, Ethan borrowed an old laptop from Harold Benson. The elderly veteran he had met earlier returned carrying the machine wrapped in a blanket. Harold was still thin and weathered, but beneath his tired appearance lived a stubborn loyalty. Anyone Martha helped eventually became protective of her. "If this thing still works, it'll be a miracle," Harold joked. It worked. Barely. Using a weak internet connection from a nearby town library network, Ethan began digging through public records. Hours passed. Property transfers appeared. Company names changed. Shell corporations emerged and disappeared. The deeper he looked, the stranger the situation became. Someone had gone to great lengths to bury the land's original purpose. Late that afternoon, Ranger suddenly stood. His ears rose, his body stiffened. Without hesitation, he limped toward the door. Ethan followed. Fresh footprints surrounded the shack. Large boot prints, recent. Neither Ethan nor Martha recognized them. The tracks circled the structure before disappearing toward the river road. "They've been watching," Ethan said quietly. Martha looked uncomfortable, but not surprised. "That's happened before." The answer disturbed him. "Before?" "Sometimes people stop nearby. Sometimes they take pictures." "How long?" "A few years." Ethan stared at her. She spoke about surveillance the same way most people discussed rain, as though it had become a normal part of life. That evening he made a decision. He was done treating this like a simple eviction. The following morning he drove into town using a borrowed pickup from Harold. Martha refused to let him spend money on a hotel, so he promised to return before dark. Ranger accompanied him despite the healing injury. In town, Ethan visited the county records office. The employee working behind the counter was a woman in her early 50s named Linda Foster. She was tall and slender with shoulder-length silver blonde hair, kind brown eyes, and the cautious expression of someone who had spent years navigating local politics without becoming part of them. When Ethan explained what he was researching, Linda hesitated. Then she lowered her voice. "You're not the first person who's asked questions about that property. What happened to the others?" They stopped asking. The answer carried enough meaning on its own. Before Ethan left, Linda quietly handed him copies of several public documents she claimed anyone could request. "Be careful," she said. Ethan thanked her and returned to the shack. He arrived just before sunset. The moment he stepped from the truck, he knew something was wrong. Ranger knew too. The German Shepherd jumped out and began barking. The front door hung open. One window had been shattered. Ethan sprinted across the snow. Inside, the shack looked as though a storm had passed through it. The cot had been overturned. Food cans were crushed across the floor. Drawers had been emptied. Clothing lay scattered everywhere. The metal document box sat open beside the wall. Martha stood silently near the stove. For several terrible seconds, Ethan feared she had been injured. Then he saw she was unharmed. "Only shaken. They came while I was gathering firewood," she said softly. "Did you see them?" She shook her head. Ranger moved through the room, sniffing every corner. Eventually, he stopped near the window and growled. Someone had entered deliberately. Not to steal, to send a message. Ethan looked around the destroyed shack. A woman who owned almost nothing had somehow become threatening enough to intimidate. That told him everything he needed to know. Later that night, after helping Martha clean the damage, Ethan sat beside the stove and reviewed everything he had collected. The original land donation, the suspicious transfers, the surveillance, the vandalism, the intimidation. Individually, none of it was enough. Together, it painted a very different picture. For the first time since arriving at the river, Ethan opened his social media account. Years earlier, it had attracted thousands of followers because of his military service and community work. He rarely used it anymore. Tonight he made an exception. He uploaded photographs of the damaged shack. He uploaded copies of the original land documents. Then he uploaded a picture of Martha standing beside Ranger, a homeless woman who had used her last blanket to save a dying dog. Finally, he typed a short message. "The woman in these photographs has spent years helping homeless veterans and forgotten people. Now someone wants her gone. I think people deserve to know why." Ethan pressed post. Within minutes, the first notification appeared, then another, then dozens more. Outside, snow began falling again. Inside the shack, neither Ethan nor Martha had any idea that the story was already beginning to spread, far beyond Montana. The snow had fallen all night. By morning, the riverbank looked untouched, as if the world itself had been covered by a clean, white blanket. Yet inside Martha Collins's small shack, there was nothing peaceful about the atmosphere. Ethan Walker sat at the table watching the screen of Harold's aging laptop as new notifications continued arriving every few seconds. The post he had uploaded the night before had spread far beyond Montana. Messages were pouring in from every corner of the country. Some came from veterans, some came from firefighters, some came from police officers, others came from ordinary people who simply wanted to help. What surprised Ethan most was how many of them already knew Martha. One man wrote that she had paid for a bus ticket when he was stranded after losing his job. Another explained that Martha had sat with him through an entire night when he was considering ending his life. A woman from Wyoming claimed Martha had secretly mailed winter clothes to her children years earlier, after hearing they had no heat. Ethan looked across the room. Martha was repairing a tear in one of Ranger's blankets. She seemed completely unaware that hundreds of strangers were talking about her online. Or, perhaps, she simply didn't care. The woman had spent so many years helping people quietly that attention made her uncomfortable. Ranger lay beside her feet. His shoulder had healed enough that he could walk almost normally again. The German shepherd watched the room with calm amber eyes, occasionally lifting his head whenever another vehicle passed on the distant road. 3 days remained before the eviction deadline. The second day after Ethan's post, a local television crew arrived. The reporter was a woman named Rebecca Hayes, approximately 45 years old, with shoulder-length auburn hair, intelligent green eyes, and the composed confidence of someone who had spent decades asking difficult questions. Unlike many reporters Ethan had met in the past, Rebecca listened more than she talked. She spent nearly 2 hours interviewing Martha. The older woman answered every question honestly. She never exaggerated, never complained, never portrayed herself as a victim. When Rebecca asked why she had spent years helping strangers despite living in poverty herself, Martha simply shrugged. "Everyone gets cold eventually," she said. "If you've got a fire, you share it." The interview aired that evening. By sunrise the following morning, the story had become national news. Donations began arriving. Letters arrived. Phone calls arrived. More importantly, people began arriving. The first visitors were veterans. A former Marine drove 6 hours through winter weather just to shake Martha's hand. Then, a retired Army medic appeared carrying supplies. Then, another veteran arrived with firewood. Then, another brought groceries. The small riverside property slowly transformed into something Ethan had never expected: hope. For years, Martha had quietly helped forgotten people one at a time. Now, those people were returning. By the 6th day, dozens of vehicles lined the river road. The development company noticed. So did the people behind it. That afternoon, Ethan received a call from Linda Foster, the county records employee who had helped him earlier. Her voice sounded tense. "They know you're digging." "Who does?" "The people behind the project." Ethan wasn't surprised. "What else?" Linda hesitated. "There's an emergency meeting scheduled tomorrow morning." "The eviction day." "Yes." The line went silent for several seconds. "Ethan," she said quietly, "be careful." That evening, another important visitor arrived. His name was Daniel Mercer. He was 48 years old, broad-shouldered, with short black hair streaked by gray, a trimmed beard, and the steady gaze of a man who had spent most of his life investigating liars. Years working as a federal investigator had given him patience, but losing a brother during military service had given him a deep respect for veterans. Daniel stepped inside the shack and introduced himself. "I saw the documents online." Ethan studied him carefully. "You believe them?" Daniel nodded. "I verified some of the records myself before coming." For several hours, they reviewed the evidence together. By midnight, Daniel's expression had grown increasingly grim. "This is bigger than a land dispute," he finally said. Ethan already suspected that. "The original trust was altered," Daniel continued. "Several property transfers should never have been approved." "Can it be proven?" Daniel looked directly at him. "Yes." It was the first truly good news Ethan had heard in days. Morning arrived cold and clear. Eviction day. Martha woke before sunrise and quietly prepared coffee. She seemed strangely calm. Perhaps because she had already lost everything once. Fear had less power over people who had survived that. The first vehicle appeared just after 7, then another, then 10 more. Ethan stepped outside and stared. Pickup trucks rolled down the river road. Motorcycles followed, then SUVs, then buses. Vehicles arrived from every direction. By 8 o'clock, the road was packed. By 9 o'clock, the crowd stretched farther than Ethan could see. Veterans stood shoulder to shoulder beside firefighters. Police officers stood beside teachers. Families stood beside homeless men who had once slept near Martha's stove. Some carried flags, others carried signs. Most carried nothing except gratitude. Martha stepped outside and froze. Tears immediately filled her eyes. A man in his 70s approached first. Ethan recognized him from one of the messages online. The veteran removed his cap. "You saved my life 20 years ago," he said. Another stepped forward. "Mine too." Then another. Then another. The line seemed endless. People hugged her. People thanked her. People cried. Many simply stood nearby because words were no longer enough. At 10 o'clock, several black luxury SUVs appeared. The crowd grew quiet. Victor Langford stepped out first. The businessman was 58, tall and lean, with silver hair combed neatly backward and expensive clothing that looked untouched by the winter cold. His face carried the confidence of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted. Behind him came lawyers, consultants, company representatives, then county officials. Victor surveyed the crowd with visible irritation. "This gathering changes nothing," he announced. No one moved. No one answered. They simply remained standing. 1,000 people protecting a 73-year-old woman and a small shack. Daniel Mercer stepped forward, carrying a thick folder. "So, does this change anything?" Victor's confidence faltered slightly. Daniel opened the folder. Inside were copies of the original trust documents, financial records, property transfers, and newly verified evidence linking multiple illegal transactions together. Television cameras immediately focused on him. Federal agents arrived minutes later. Not local officers, federal agents. Victor's attorneys began talking rapidly. County officials turned pale. One attempted to leave. He didn't get far. By noon, the story had completely changed. This was no longer an eviction. It was a corruption investigation. One by one, officials were questioned. Documents were seized. Statements were recorded. The development project was immediately suspended, pending investigation. Victor Langford stood silently as agents informed him that he would need to answer questions regarding the property's acquisition. The crowd remained remarkably calm. Nobody cheered. Nobody celebrated. Most people simply watched. Because the real victory wasn't seeing powerful men investigated. The real victory was seeing Martha realize she was no longer alone. As the afternoon sun reflected across the frozen river, Ethan looked toward the old woman. She stood surrounded by people she had once helped. Some were veterans. Some were strangers. All had returned. Ranger sat beside her, tail moving slowly against the snow. For the first time since Ethan had met her, Martha looked overwhelmed, not by fear, by love. And as she wiped tears from her cheeks, one truth became impossible to ignore. The woman everyone had forgotten had never actually been forgotten at all. The investigation moved faster than anyone expected. Within days of the confrontation on the riverbank, federal authorities formally suspended the entire development project. News crews remained in town. Lawyers arrived from neighboring states. Financial records were subpoenaed. Former county officials who had once seemed untouchable suddenly found themselves answering difficult questions under oath. For the first time in many years, people with money and influence were being forced to explain themselves. Yet none of that mattered much to Martha Collins. On the morning after the eviction attempt failed, Ethan Walker found her standing outside the shack, watching the sunrise spread across the frozen river. The old woman wore the same patched sweater she had worn the night he arrived during the blizzard. The river reflected shades of gold and pale pink beneath the winter sky. "You should be celebrating," Ethan said. Martha smiled softly. "I'm 73 years old." "What does that mean?" "It means I've learned not to celebrate until the work is finished." Ethan looked toward the crowded riverside road. Volunteers were already unloading supplies from trucks. Veterans who had traveled hundreds of miles remained in town to help. For the first time since he had met her, Martha seemed uncertain. Not afraid, not worried, simply uncertain. For years, she had expected nothing from anyone. Receiving kindness in return felt unfamiliar. During the following weeks, the investigation continued to expand. More evidence emerged, showing that the original Veterans Trust had been deliberately manipulated years earlier. Several officials accepted plea agreements. Victor Langford disappeared from public view while legal proceedings advanced. The riverside land was eventually returned to the original trust, established decades before by Colonel Thomas Bennett. That decision changed everything. Because once the land's original purpose was restored, people began asking a simple question: what should happen next? The answer came from the very people Martha had spent years helping. Donations continued arriving from around the country. Some contributions were large, many were small. A retired teacher mailed $20, along with a handwritten note. A veteran living on disability benefits sent $15. A firefighter from Arizona contributed enough money to purchase construction materials. Every donation carried the same message: Martha had helped them. Now, they wanted to help Martha. Spring arrived slowly in Montana. Snow retreated from the riverbanks. Patches of green grass appeared between muddy footprints left by volunteers. Construction crews eventually replaced the temporary tents with something far more permanent. The idea began as a simple shelter. It became much more. Architects donated. Plans. Contractors volunteered labor. Veterans provided equipment. Local businesses supplied materials at cost. What emerged over the next several months was not merely a building, it was a promise. The completed center stood, overlooking the river, where Martha's shack had once stood alone against the cold. The structure was built from timber and stone, warm and welcoming rather than institutional. Large windows faced the water. A community kitchen occupied one wing. Temporary housing for homeless veterans occupied another. Counseling rooms, medical offices, classrooms, and gathering spaces filled the rest. The sign at the entrance carried a simple name: Martha Collins House. Martha cried when she saw it. Not dramatic tears. Not the kind people perform for cameras. These were quiet tears from a woman who had spent years believing her life would pass unnoticed. Ethan stood beside her during the dedication ceremony. The former Navy SEAL looked healthier than he had in years. His familiar military-style green jacket remained unchanged, as did the calm expression that rarely left his face. Yet something inside him had shifted. The loneliness that once followed him everywhere seemed lighter now. Ranger sat proudly beside them. The German Shepherd's injured shoulder had fully healed. Only a faint scar remained beneath his black and tan fur. Children constantly approached him during the ceremony. Ranger accepted every pat and scratch with patient dignity. Somehow, the dog had become nearly as famous as Martha. The crowd gathered that day numbered in the hundreds. Many faces were familiar. Harold Benson stood near the front, holding a new cane someone had given him. He looked healthier than when Ethan first met him. Rebecca Hayes, the reporter who had helped bring national attention to the story, attended with her camera crew. Linda Foster arrived from the county records office. Even Daniel Mercer traveled back to Montana for the event. One by one, people shared stories. A veteran described sleeping in his truck during a brutal winter before Martha gave him food and blankets. A woman recalled how Martha helped her escape an abusive relationship years earlier. A paramedic explained that Martha had once spent an entire night caring for an injured stranger when nobody else would stop. The stories continued for nearly an hour. Martha listened quietly. Several times she attempted to interrupt. Several times the crowd refused to let her. For once, they wanted her to hear what she had meant to them. After the speeches ended, a young woman approached the microphone. Her name was Emily Carter, 32 years old, with dark brown hair pulled into a simple ponytail and kind hazel eyes. Years earlier, she had been the frightened young mother who arrived at Martha's shack, needing winter gloves for her daughter. Now, she worked as a school counselor. She looked directly at Martha. "You spent years helping people who felt invisible," Emily said. "Today we're here to make sure you never feel invisible again." The crowd rose to its feet. Martha covered her mouth with trembling hands. Quote, Ethan glanced at Ranger. The dog's tail swept slowly across the grass. As usual, Ranger seemed to understand exactly what mattered. In the months that followed, Martha Collins' house quickly became one of the most respected veterans support centers in the region. People arrived seeking temporary shelter, counseling, job assistance, medical referrals, or simply a warm meal. No one was turned away. Ethan accepted a permanent leadership role at the center. He handled logistics, security, transportation, and maintenance. The work suited him. For years, he had searched for a mission worthy of his skills. Now, he woke each morning knowing exactly why he was there. Martha kept a small apartment on the first floor overlooking the river. Despite having a comfortable room for the first time in years, she continued spending most of her day helping others. Some habits never changed. Ranger became the center's unofficial mascot. Veterans talked to him during difficult days. Children read books beside him. Residents often joked that Ranger knew everyone's story before the staff did. One evening, nearly a year after the blizzard, Ethan walked outside as the sun set behind the mountains. The river flowed freely now, no longer trapped beneath ice. He found Martha sitting on a bench near the water. Ranger rested at her feet. The old woman watched lights glow inside the center. People were eating dinner together, talking, laughing, living. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Martha smiled. "You know," she said softly, "I used to think I was homeless." Ethan looked toward the building carrying her name. "What changed your mind?" Martha reached down and stroked Ranger's head. The German shepherd leaned gently against her leg. Then she looked at the families, veterans, volunteers, and staff moving through the warm windows of the center. "I wasn't homeless," she said. "I just hadn't found my way back to my family yet." The river continued flowing into the distance. The center remained full of light. And for the first time in many years, nobody standing on that land had to face the cold alone. Sometimes God's greatest miracles do not arrive with flashing lights or dramatic signs. Sometimes they arrive through ordinary people who choose kindness when they have every reason not to. Martha had almost nothing, yet she gave everything she could to help others. In return, God used the lives she touched to bring hope back when she needed it most. Many of us pass people every day who seem forgotten, lonely, or invisible. This story reminds us that even the smallest act of compassion can become a blessing far greater than we ever imagine. The kindness you show today may become the miracle someone else receives tomorrow. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs encouragement. Leave a comment below and tell us where you're watching from and what lessons stayed with you the most. If you believe kindness still matters in this world, subscribe to the channel and join our community. May God bless you, protect your family, bring peace to your home, and guide your steps wherever you are. And if you're facing a difficult season in life, may you never forget that God often sends help through unexpected people at exactly the moment we need it most.